For today's 10-minute book talk, I am going to do A Canticle for Leibowitz. Now, this is a truly brilliant book. It's actually brilliant even in the more literal sense of being very bright. It's made up of 3 novellas that Walter Miller published in the 1950s in science fiction magazines. The first one's called Fiat Homo, which is Let There Be Man, or Humanity, Human Beings. The second one's Fiat Lux, Let There Be Light, basically from the beginning of Genesis. And then Fiat Voluntas Tua. This is Let Your Will Be Done, Thy Will Be Done, from the Lord's Prayer. These 3 sections of the book make up 3 different times at different points in the world. One of them set about 500 years from now, one of them set about 1,000 years from now, and another about 500 years after that, 500 or 600 years after that. These 3 time segments are all timed actually to when this book was originally published. In 1950s, 1960s, in the timeline within A Canticle for Leibowitz, there is a waterless flood, Margaret Atwood might call it, a flame deluge, it's called in the book, a nuclear holocaust that destroys much of humanity and most of civilization throughout the world, so that all that we see in the first book, Fiat Homo, is a tiny world, basically the prairies of the United States, and not very much beyond that. In this tiny little world, in this desert community that has survived nuclear holocaust, there are, various kinds of hints of civilization growing. Rome has moved itself to this safe civilization and has created a new Rome in the United States, including taking the Shepherd's Ring and the Pope with them. And you have a new city-state that is growing up that is working militarily to try and create an empire. And you also have, the normal religious and daily life. So we have villages of people just trying to survive. We've actually got monks, which is mostly where this book is set. And then we also have bands of mutants, mutant hordes, although they're not terribly large hordes. Basically, the nuclear holocaust has created genetic problems. First, you would just think the birth defects were due to radiation in the soil and the water and the air, but actually these become genetic deformities that pop up generation after generation. So people are born with, one eye, or with extra limbs, or with missing limbs, or with bodies that look monstrous, super big, super small, and even bicephalopods, basically 2-headed people. This sort of mutation continues for 1,500 years after the waterless flood, after the flame deluge. And they are protected by the church. They were originally victims of infanticide. When the children were born, they were killed, but then the church protected them, saying that they were living beings, and so they deserved life. They grow up in orphanages or in homes, but then they would often gather in bands out in the communities, out in the wildernesses, and they would become highwaymen, robbing and stealing and things like that. So this is the kind of civilization, and we pop in about 500 years, 600 years from right now, into a moment where it looks kind of medievally. We actually start with Brother Francis. He's really my favorite character in the whole story. And Brother Francis is on a Lenten fast in the wilderness in an old civilization. This old civilization will turn out to have been a scientific facility of some sort in a town, or on the outskirts of a village around a scientific outpost, and including a nuclear bunker, a nuclear safety bunker. But it's just rubble now in Brother Francis's timeline. He's on a Lenten fast, and he is then starving in the desert, trying to stay safe from wild animals and safe from the sun. And he meets a pilgrim along the road. And this pilgrim speaks other languages, writes differently, but also knows Brother Francis's languages. And these 2 characters root the entire story. The pilgrim along the road turns out to be a figure of the wandering Jew, someone who wanders for centuries throughout the world, waiting for Messiah to come, and at various points pops into the story in each of the 3 books. Most effectively in the first 2 books, and really most effectively in meeting Francis in the first book. He helps Francis find a stone, and in doing so leads Francis to discover some documents that are linked to the Saint Leibowitz, or the Blessed Leibowitz, who they want to be a saint. Now, Leibowitz is in the title, and what is the Canticle? Okay, Leibowitz was basically a Jewish a Jewish scientist of the 20th centuries in America. After the Holocaust, his wife died, and he decided to go and become a monk. He became Catholic, converted, took up vows, and his order was dedicated to saving civilization's materials. So they became bookleggers in a society like bootleggers, but they smuggled books, they copied ideas, they created scriptoriums, and in a generation that was burning all books and trying to eradicate all knowledge. And they dedicate themselves in a small monastery in the desert, maybe somewhere around Utah or closer to the mountains. And their whole life is dedicated to keeping knowledge they don't even understand. These are like, the Irish monks of medieval period, as you can get in Thomas Cahill's book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. It's a brilliant and beautiful book. It's the same kind of thing. These monks holding on to civilization's knowledge until some future generation can come and use it well. Leibowitz then, because of these newfound documents by Brother Francis, Leibowitz then becomes fully canonized, becomes a saint, and their abbey becomes important to the next 1,000 years of development in America, and what used to be America. Well, what is this book? Well, this book is a philosophical story. It's actually 3 philosophical stories. It deals with the question of what is a human, where is God in the face of suffering, how does morality work when society and moral choices are really at odds with one another, what does it mean to be called by God to do something? These are the kind of philosophical questions that this book really struggles with, and really should be read as a series of 3 novellas rather than a single novel. Walter Miller is a gorgeous writer. It's beautifully written, but it's also written to alienate you. I mean, how many of us have a lot of friends that are, say, monks, right? The world in which he describes, the monastery as it grows over the 1,200 years from the book's beginning to the ending, from the period of the deluge until the end of the book, it's crazy development takes place, and new canon law and new development and philosophical struggle and internal struggle. It's all there, and that's why this book is valuable. In the end, it's going to ask the question of the futility of what we do, because if we save the knowledge of civilization that has been wiped out because of a nuclear war, won't we inevitably come to the point where we can create another nuclear holocaust? Isn't that the normal result of things? Doesn't scientific progress not only bring us the ability to avoid tooth decay and maybe to cure cancer and maybe to feed the people that are starving, but also the ability to kill ourselves in a single sweeping movement? That could be technological in the case of nuclear warfare, or that could be something like a plague that was created, or something like another kind of environmental destruction. That's the reality. That's the question. And it's such a great question because it's not just a question of monks, saving civilization. It's a question of all of us who are parents and teachers and writers and historians and scientists who are passing on knowledge. What we do is dangerous. And so what we do can't be done unless it's also done within a context of how to think about ethics and how to rule and teach and lead and parent well. Okay, well, that's the philosophical stuff, but the reality is what draws me into this book is not just the philosophical theological discussion. It's not just the kind of beautiful and troubling world that he creates. It's not just the lovely prose that reads like poetry a lot of the times. It's actually the characters. The characters are brilliant. I want to be Brother Francis's friend. I wish there was a whole more book on just Brother Francis. I love the Abbots in each of the 3 books. I dislike one of them, but I love it for that sake. And I love the Wandering Jew character, who may actually be the Blessed Leibowitz. We're not sure, but I love that character. It's just such a beautiful attention to characters. And so what happens is you get a Canticle for Leibowitz. The song for Leibowitz is a series of stories that are philosophical, that are literary, that are filled with science fiction and fantastic description, and yet they have the ability to draw us near to the heart of the character's struggle. And that, I think, is what makes a brilliant novel. Now, that's my 10-minute book talk on A Canticle for Leibowitz. Make sure to check me out on Twitter at Brenton Dana. Search for me, Brenton Dickieson, on Instagram. Follow the blog at pilgriminarnia.com. And I would encourage you to subscribe here on YouTube so that you can get future 10-minute book talks and other sorts of teaching and learning sessions that I have. Take care.